Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for holding this hearing today and inviting me to be a part of it. I'm looking forward to discussing the worldwide threats that this country faces and the work that President Trump and his administration does each and every day to make America safe again. I'm very privileged and honored today to have my family with me. I'd like to introduce them to you.
Disruptions of congressional business is a violation of law, is a criminal offense under federal law. Audience members are advised to take their seats and maintain order. The chairman may now ask Capitol Police to remove and arrest the persons creating the disturbance.
You just witnessed the machinery of authoritarian power grinding into motion with the precision of a totalitarian state. And if your blood isn't boiling right now, then you haven't been paying attention, because what we just saw wasn't merely a congressional hearing disrupted by protesters exercising their First Amendment rights, but rather a chilling demonstration of how quickly democratic space collapses when fascistic impulses meet the banality of procedural language. And here's what you need to understand before we go any further, because this is absolutely essential to grasping the magnitude of what's unfolding in real time across this country. A House Democrat is demanding impeachment hearings into DHS Secretary Kristi Noem, accusing her of unethical behavior, including allegedly receiving DHS contract money and making false and misleading statements to Congress about DHS and ICE operations while ignoring court orders. And a federal judge has ordered 2 Justice Department officials to testify in a case examining whether Noem should face criminal charges for allegedly violating a March 2025 order halting the removal of Venezuelan migrants, which means the woman sitting at that table claiming to make America safe, again, is herself potentially a criminal, who has weaponized the entire apparatus of Homeland Security to terrorize communities of color, while enriching herself and her cronies in a pattern so brazen it would make the robber barons of the Gilded Age blush with shame. Let me paint you the picture of what's really happening here, because the corporate media will never tell you this story with the moral clarity it demands, and we're about to drop bombshell after bombshell that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the so-called rule of law in this country. Protesters interrupted Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem as she delivered her opening statement at a House hearing on worldwide threats, holding signs and calling for an end to immigration and customs enforcement raids. And the committee chair immediately reached for the cudgel of federal criminal law to silence dissent, invoking the specter of arrest and imprisonment for the high crime of speaking truth to power in a public forum that is supposed to belong to the people. The protesters were shouting, "Get off our streets and stop terrorizing our community," because that's precisely what's happening in neighborhoods from Minneapolis to New Orleans to Portland, where the Trump administration has set a daily arrest quota of 3,000 undocumented immigrants, wherein more than 65,000 people were in ICE detention as of mid-November, creating a sprawling archipelago of suffering that would make Alexandra Solzhenitsyn weep. But wait, because it gets so much worse, and you need to hear this, because the scale of what we're witnessing is genuinely unprecedented in modern American history. Immigration authorities have targeted workplaces, farms, university campuses, and private homes, including a high-profile raid in September when nearly 500 workers, most of whom were South Korean nationals, were detained at a Hyundai electric vehicle plant in Savannah, Georgia, sparking protests from labor unions and rattling the U.S.-South Korean alliance. Think about the geopolitical implications of that for just one moment, because we're alienating our democratic allies and destroying international relationships in service of a white nationalist fever dream masquerading as immigration enforcement. As of November 2025, ICE has signed more than 1,100 agreements with state and local law enforcement covering 40 states, a sharp increase from the 135 agreements it had in December 2024, which means we're watching the federalization of a deportation regime that's turning local police departments into extensions of ICE and fundamentally restructuring the relationship between immigrant communities and any form of public safety. Now let's talk about what happened in that hearing room, because the symbolism is so perfect it's almost too on the nose. And this is where the performative cruelty meets the bureaucratic violence that Hannah Arendt warned us about when she coined the phrase, the banality of evil. Kristi Noem sits there with her family arrayed around her like some Norman Rockwell painting of American respectability, preparing to discuss the work that President Trump and his administration does each and every day to make America safe again, which is Orwellian doublespeak of the highest order, because what they're actually doing is making America terrifying for millions of people whose only crime is seeking a better life, and the moment voices of resistance pierce that carefully constructed facade, the chairman doesn't engage with the substance of their concerns or acknowledge the legitimacy of their grievances, but instead immediately threatens them with the full force of federal criminal prosecution. This is textbook authoritarian playbook, straight out of the writings of Timothy Snyder and Jason Stanley, scholars who have documented how fascism always begins with the criminalization of dissent and the transformation of political opposition into criminal conspiracy. And here's another bombshell that should shake you to your core, because the violence isn't just rhetorical or symbolic, but increasingly physical and brutal. In several cities, federal agents deployed by the president have detained, chased, shoved, sprayed, or shot with projectiles people protesting peacefully. Increasingly intense confrontations have erupted since Trump ordered the surge of law enforcement and troops in American cities, though the incidents reviewed by CNN mostly involve protests outside of detention facilities, not during immigration operations, which can quickly turn unpredictable, which means federal agents are using violence against people simply for exercising their constitutional rights to observe and document government action. Federal agents are now often masked and lack any markings that would make it easy to identify them, and a series of recent Supreme Court decisions have severely limited the ability of people to sue federal law enforcement officers for excessive force claims, creating a perfect storm of unaccountable state violence that would be immediately recognizable to anyone who studied the rise of paramilitary forces in authoritarian regimes throughout the 20th century. Let me give you some specific examples, because the abstract analysis only takes us so far, and we need to confront the visceral reality of what's being done in our name. Government records showed that 20 detainees have died in ICE custody since Trump took office, a number nearly matching the total deaths recorded during the entire Biden administration. The population inside ICE detention has reached more than 60,000 people, with tent facilities and frequent transfers contributing to lost medical records and interrupted treatment. People are literally dying in custody because attorneys representing detainees described a pattern of worsening medical neglect, with one staff attorney reporting a client with untreated diabetes whose medicine was simply stopped. This is state-sanctioned neglect that rises to the level of torture under international human rights law, and it's happening right now in facilities scattered across this country, while Kristi Noem sits in congressional hearings talking about making America safe. But the resistance is building, and this is where we need to shift gears, because despair is a luxury we cannot afford, and the story of what's happening in the streets is just as important as the story of what's happening in the halls of power. Immigration-related demonstrations have reached a record high this year, with these protests making up 27% of total reported events, marking a sharp increase from just 3% for all of 2024, and protests in support of immigrant rights have accounted for 97% of all immigration-related demonstrations occurring in all 50 states and D.C., with over 700 immigration-related demonstrations recorded. This is a genuine mass movement emerging in real time, and here's what makes it so powerful and so threatening to the administration. It's not just happening in the usual bastions of progressive resistance, but spreading to places that were supposed to be part of Trump's base. About 135 people gathered along a highway in Boone, North Carolina, a small Appalachian college town not known as a hotbed of leftist protest, holding signs reading, "Nazis were just following orders too," and "Time to melt the ice," chanting profane rebukes at immigration and customs enforcement agents rumored to be in the area. It was easy enough for politicians to paint resistance to immigration raids as the province of big city liberals or communities of color. But what happens when predominantly white, working-class towns start throwing sand in the gears of the deportation machine? This is the question that keeps Republican strategists up at night, because ordinary people are finding common cause with those they were told to blame for their economic woes, threatening to upend the narrative that Appalachia will forever serve as obedient foot soldiers for someone else's crusade. The class consciousness that's emerging here is absolutely revolutionary in its implications, because it's piercing through decades of carefully cultivated racial resentment and economic scapegoating. And in cities across the country, people are getting trained in resistance tactics that draw on a rich history of civil disobedience and direct action. Thousands of parents, teachers, clergy, and community organizers have sought training on what they can legally do when they see an immigration raid unfold, learning to document federal actions and create networks of mutual aid and protection. On the first school day after immigration agents flooded into Charlotte, a resident's teacher husband reported that only 5 of his students had shown up for class, and more than 30,000 students, about 20% of district enrollment, were absent from Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools because families were too terrified to leave their homes, which is economic terrorism pure and simple, because fearing an encounter with ICE or CBP Many migrants retreated into isolation as local businesses felt the blow, with workers staying home and classroom seats sitting empty. Now let's return to that hearing room and think about what it means when the state responds to this kind of moral witness with threats of criminal prosecution, because this is where the theoretical rubber meets the practical road of resistance. The chairman invokes federal law, making disruption of congressional business a criminal offense, wielding the language of legality as a weapon against people who are trying to testify to the human cost of the policies being discussed in that very room. But here's what you need to understand about the nature of civil disobedience and its role in democratic societies, drawing on the work of everyone from Henry David Thoreau to Martin Luther King Jr. to John Rawls. Sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is refuse to comply with unjust laws, and sometimes the most moral thing you can do is disrupt the smooth functioning of institutions that are perpetrating injustice. Those protesters aren't criminals in any meaningful moral sense. They're people who have recognized that normal channels of democratic participation have been foreclosed and that extraordinary measures are required to pierce the veil of normalcy that allows atrocities to continue. And make no mistake, what we're witnessing is atrocity on a mass scale, even if it's being carried out with bureaucratic efficiency rather than overt violence. ICE has decided to target people without criminal convictions or charges, making more collateral arrests of undocumented people who happen to be with someone on a target list. And while the Trump administration highlights the worst of the worst amongst its arrests, the majority of people arrested don't have another criminal violation. This exposes the lie at the heart of the administration's rhetoric, because they're not targeting dangerous criminals, they're terrorizing entire communities and ripping families apart based on immigration status alone. One man who was wrongfully detained told PBS that he and his wife are too scared to even go outside to the store because of ICE activity in their neighborhoods. And he said if he gets detained again, he'll just sign his deportation right away because he doesn't want to go through the same nightmare again. Read that again and let it sink in, because this is a person with legal status to work in this country who has been so traumatized by his encounter with immigration enforcement that he would rather self-deport than risk being detained again. This is psychological torture, and it's working exactly as intended. But here's where we need to talk about the deeper structural forces at work, because this isn't just about one administration or one moment in time, but rather about the culmination of decades of bipartisan consensus around border per sec, militarization, and the construction of what scholars call the deportation regime. Under Noem, DHS has bucked precedent by requesting troves of personal data from states and other federal agencies to assist in deportation efforts, arresting people at courthouses, sending immigrants to countries they have no ties to, and in some cases known for human rights abuses, and ignoring court orders. That last part is crucial because what we're seeing is the executive branch simply refusing to comply with judicial oversight, which is a constitutional crisis of the first order. A DOJ official allegedly told DOJ lawyers that the planes need to take off no matter what, in reference to deportation flights that violated a judge's order, and Secretary Noem submitted a declaration stating she made the decision to continue the transfer of custody of detainees who had been removed before the court issued its temporary restraining order, though the judge found this insufficient to determine whether it constituted a willful violation. This is the architecture of authoritarianism being built in real time, and the protesters in that hearing room understood something that too many comfortable liberals refuse to acknowledge. Normal politics will not stop this. You cannot vote your way out of fascism once the institutions of democratic accountability have been captured by actors who view legal constraints as mere obstacles to be circumvented, and you cannot rely on the courts to protect vulnerable people when the Supreme Court has spent decades systematically dismantling the constitutional protections that might constrain immigration enforcement. Some legal experts say Trump is pushing the limits of presidential power, including by invoking centuries-old statutes and expediting deportations, while immigrant rights activists warn that the administration's aggressive tactics have eroded migrants' due process protections. This is constitutional hardball played with people's lives as the stakes. And let's be absolutely clear about the racial subtext that animates every aspect of this enforcement regime, because we cannot understand what's happening without confronting the white supremacist ideology that undergirds it. An immigrant rights advocate said about Trump's policies that this has never been about vetting or security and safety, but about cruelty, noting that his war on immigrants and his mass deportation agenda is all to lead to making America white again. This is ethnic cleansing dressed up in the language of law and order, and a growing number of people, many of them Latins, have reported being targeted, harassed, and detained by ICE and CBP agents solely because of their race, with a recent Brookings study on racial profiling pointing to a September Supreme Court decision that lifted an order stopping ICE from targeting people based on race, language, and place of work. The Supreme Court literally gave ICE permission to engage in racial profiling, codifying into constitutional law the principle that brown skin is reasonable suspicion for immigration enforcement. There are countless reports of U.S. citizens arrested or temporarily detained by immigration agents, and a ProPublica investigation found more than 170 cases this year where citizens were detained at raids and protests. Think about what that means, because this isn't just about immigrants anymore. It's about the transformation of entire communities into sites of suspicion, where anyone who looks or sounds foreign can be subjected to demands for papers and detention. This is the infrastructure of a police state being normalized through the rhetoric of immigration enforcement, and it's been facilitated by judges ordering hundreds of people released because they were arrested without a warrant in Chicago, while a judge in Washington, D.C., also halted warrantless arrests after an enforcement surge drew litigation, which tells you everything you need to know about how lawless this enforcement regime has become. Now let me tell you about the incredible acts of solidarity and mutual aid that are emerging in response, because this is where hope lives, even in the darkest times. Los Angeles County officials approved an emergency declaration that will cover living expenses for people who miss work because they fear immigration raids, and it started accepting requests for aid in December. Creating a material basis for resistance that allows people to survive even when they're too afraid to go to work. The San Francisco District Attorney hatched a plan to charge ICE agents for violating state laws as they carried out arrests, such as violating the statewide ban on agents wearing masks and possible excessive force, using local prosecutorial power to create consequences for federal overreach. More than a dozen demonstrators were arrested in Lower Manhattan after attempting to stop federal agents from conducting immigration and enforcement activities, with the group of protesters chanting "ICE out of New York" and locking arms to form a barrier blocking federal agents from exiting a garage. These are people literally putting their bodies on the line to protect their neighbors, and that's the kind of courage that has always been the foundation of successful social movements. But the state's response to this resistance reveals just how threatened it feels by organized opposition. Rep. Benny Thompson called on DHS Secretary Kristi Noem to resign at a hearing, excoriating her overuse of department resources, saying instead of deploying Homeland Security grants to protect churches and synagogues from terrorism, she handed her friends a $220 million contract so they could follow her around with a camera, and instead of fully funding the DHS agency that protects hospitals, schools, and electrical systems from cyber attacks, she spent $200 million to buy herself new private jets, and instead of paying her way like the rest of us, she's living rent-free in a taxpayer-owned property reserved for military leaders. This is kleptocracy masquerading as law enforcement, with Noem using the apparatus of Homeland Security as her personal piggy bank, while people die in detention facilities from medical neglect. And when elected officials try to exercise their oversight responsibilities or stand in solidarity with immigrant communities, they face arrest themselves. New York City Comptroller and mayoral candidate Brad Lander was arrested by ICE at a Manhattan courthouse after he was seen holding on to a man being detained and saying he will let go when they show him the judicial warrant, and at least 4 other officials have been arrested or confronted by authorities after speaking out against the administration's immigration policies. The mayor of Newark was arrested after traveling to inspect Delaney Hall Detention Center, and 3 members of New Jersey's congressional delegation tried to enter the facility when ICE agents arrested the mayor on trespassing charges. This is what it looks like when the federal government decides that accountability is a crime and oversight is obstruction. Let's zoom back to that hearing room one more time, because I want you to really sit with the symbolism of what happened there. Kristi Noem is introducing her family, performing the ritual of American respectability, wrapping herself in the flag and the rhetoric of safety, and in that moment protesters interrupt to say the quiet part out loud, that the work she's describing is terrorism, that ICE presence in communities is violence, that deportation destroys families just as surely as any other form of state violence. And the response from the chairman is immediate and decisive. This is a criminal offense under federal law. You will be arrested. You will be removed, returned to order. But what is order in the context of mass deportation? What is civility in the face of ethnic cleansing? What is the appropriate response to policies that are quite literally killing people through neglect and trauma and separation? These are the questions that the protesters force us to confront, and they're questions that cannot be answered through the procedural norms of congressional hearings or the polite fictions of bipartisan cooperation. A poll found that 61% of California voters surveyed said they want California's prison system to stop directly handing immigrants over to ICE for deportation, even though the state's sanctuary law does not apply to immigrants convicted of serious crimes, and state prisons have transferred to ICE more than 9,500 people with criminal records since Governor Newsom took office in 2019, with 1,217 inmates picked up directly from state prisons so far in 2025. Even in the context of people who have been convicted of crimes, there's growing recognition that deportation is not justice, and that due process matters, and that the humanity of people should not be contingent on their immigration status. Recent polls found that 61% of registered California voters oppose deporting everyone without legal status. 71% of Californians disapproved of the job ICE is doing, and about 3/4 of California voters said they're dissatisfied with or angry about the way things are going in the U.S., with 6 in 10 saying the Trump administration's actions on immigration enforcement have gone too far. Public opinion is shifting in real time as people witness the brutality of enforcement, as they see their neighbors disappeared, as they watch children kept home from school because their parents are too terrified to drive them, as the human cost of these policies becomes impossible to ignore. But the administration doesn't care about public opinion, because this was never about security or safety, or even about immigration policy in any rational sense. It's about performing dominance and instilling fear, and sending a message about who belongs in America and who doesn't. The Trump administration said it would continue its program of raids and deportations despite the protests, with Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem posting on social media that ICE will continue to enforce the law. The circular logic is perfect. The law says we can do this, therefore we will do this. And if you object to us doing this, then you are by definition a criminal, because you are disrupting the enforcement of the law. This is legal positivism taken to its authoritarian extreme, divorced from any consideration of justice or morality or human dignity. So what do we do with all of this? How do we respond to the machinery of deportation grinding forward with the full backing of federal law enforcement and a compliant court system and a congressional majority that views oversight as obstruction? The protesters in that hearing room have given us a roadmap, and it's the same roadmap that every successful resistance movement in history has followed. You make the normal functioning of injustice impossible. You refuse to grant legitimacy to illegitimate authority. You force people to confront the violence that they would prefer to ignore. You build networks of solidarity and mutual aid that can sustain resistance over the long haul. Local resistance efforts have given rise to an informal national network of people looking to each other for lessons on how to push back without confrontation and support their neighbors in the process, with one organizer saying he wants to live in an area of solidarity and asking, how can we alert our neighbors? How can we keep them safe? How do we do it in nonviolence? This is the work of building what the political theorist James Scott called weapons of the weak, the everyday acts of resistance that collectively can gum up the works of even the most powerful enforcement apparatus. It's teachers creating safe spaces for immigrant students. It's clergy providing sanctuary in churches. It's lawyers flooding the courts with habeas petitions. It's neighbors forming ICE watch networks to document arrests. It's local officials using their authority to make life harder for federal agents. It's all of these small acts adding up to something that can actually slow the machinery of deportation and create space for people to survive and organize and fight back. But we also need to be honest about the scale of what we're up against, because the forces arrayed in support of mass deportation are not going to be defeated by moral witness alone. This requires political power. It requires sustained organizing. It requires building multiracial coalitions that can see through the divide-and-conquer tactics that have always been used to pit working people against each other. And it requires a willingness to escalate our tactics when necessary, to understand that there are moments when civility becomes complicity, and when the only moral response is to make governance impossible until the violence stops. Those protesters being dragged out of that hearing room understood something essential, that the time for polite disagreement has passed, that the normal channels of democratic participation have been closed off, that the only way to register opposition to atrocity is to refuse to let business continue as usual. They're part of a long tradition of civil disobedience in this country, from the abolitionists who harbored escaped slaves in violation of the Fugitive Slave Act, to the civil rights activists who sat at segregated lunch counters, to the Vietnam War protesters who shut down draft boards, to the AIDS activists who occupied the FDA to demand life-saving medication. Every single one of those movements was told that they were going about it the wrong way, that they needed to work within the system, that their tactics were too disruptive and alienating, and every single one of them succeeded precisely because they refused to accept those limitations. So when you see that clip of the committee chair threatening to have Capitol Police arrest the protesters, when you hear him invoking federal law and criminal penalties, when you watch the machinery of the state moving to suppress dissent, I want you to remember that this is what power looks like when it's threatened. They wouldn't need to threaten arrest if they weren't afraid of what those voices represent, if they weren't worried about the movement that's building in the streets, if they weren't concerned that public opinion is turning against them even in places that were supposed to be their strongholds. The protests erupting across the country, from Boone, North Carolina to New Orleans to Manhattan to Portland, are a sign that people have had enough, that they're willing to risk arrest and violence to stand up for their neighbors, that they're recognizing mass deportation for what it is, a crime against humanity being carried out with bureaucratic precision. And that recognition is spreading, which is why the response from the state is getting more violent and more desperate. A Presbyterian pastor named Reverend David Black was repeatedly shot with pepper balls outside an ICE facility in Broadview, Illinois in October, drawing sharp public criticism over agents' treatment of clergy, and a federal agent sprayed a chemical irritant on him, as he and other protesters demonstrated outside an ICE facility in September 2025. They're shooting clergy members with less lethal munitions for the crime of bearing witness. This is the kind of state violence that's usually associated with authoritarian regimes in other countries, but it's happening here and now in cities across America, and it will continue happening until we build the political power necessary to stop it. This is our moment. This is our test. This is when we find out whether we have the courage and the commitment to stand up to fascism before it fully consolidates its power. The protesters in that hearing room passed the test. They showed up knowing they would be arrested, knowing they would be branded as criminals, knowing they would face consequences for speaking truth to power, and they did it anyway because some things are more important than staying safe and comfortable. Now the question is whether the rest of us will find that same courage, whether we'll build on the foundation they've laid, whether we'll recognize that every single one of us has a role to play in resistance, whether it's providing material support, or showing up to protests, or using whatever platform or privilege we have to make the violence visible and unbearable to ignore. The machinery of deportation will keep grinding forward unless we throw ourselves into the gears, unless we make it impossible for the system to function smoothly, unless we force a crisis that cannot be resolved through more of the same policies that brought us to this moment. That's what the protesters understood. That's what they were doing in that hearing room, and that's what all of us need to be doing right now, if we have any hope of stopping what one scholar rightly called the largest domestic deportation operation in American history from reaching its genocidal conclusion. The choice is ours, and the time is now.